again, everybody. Welcome back to the Silver Bullets podcast. I am Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnick.
Chip, I don't know about you, but I think I didn't really get a chance to watch this week's game against Open Date, but it couldn't have gone well for the Buckeyes because I heard they moved down in some of the polls.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how Open Date has done that to other teams besides Ohio State. So the Buckeyes are just the latest victim, I guess.
Interesting. All right, so without an Ohio State game this week, Chip, how did you spend your college football Saturday?
I was bouncing back and forth between a lot of the games that were on. My best friend from high school just celebrated his 50th birthday,
Nice.
So was able to spend it with him and his wife and my wife. So, but yeah, we were flipping back and forth. We were able to watch some of the national games as well as some of the Big Ten games. So it was a great weekend. How about you?
Yeah, I did a lot of flipping as well. I thought that some of the games I expected to be close were not. Some of the games I did not expect to be close were. And that's pretty much college football in a nutshell.
Yeah, that sounds pretty accurate.
All right, so without a Buckeye game, we'll talk about the Buckeyes at Northwestern a little later in the program. Why don't we start with a lap around the Big Ten this week?
Sounds good.
It was another big week in the Big Ten, of course. The biggest marquee game is one of those games that I kind of thought was going to be close, and it wasn't. And that was Michigan State going to Wisconsin to play the Badgers. And I thought this is you see some games in their contrast in styles, and this was two teams that like to play the same style of football, and one team played it well, and the other team did not. Probably shouldn't have even gone to Madison.
Makes you wonder if it was kind of maybe that body blow theory, that the fact that Michigan State's coming off what was a physical game against Ohio State, and then your reward is to go and play Wisconsin, which is another physical team. Like, it makes you wonder, were they just kind of that delayed hangover, so to speak, of they were just physically outmanned, and after a while just didn't have anything left to withstand against that physical Wisconsin attack.
I think that had some things to do with it. I think the weather didn't really help Brian Lewerke. I thought Lewerke played, for the most part, against Ohio State. I thought he played very, very well, and he fit the ball into some tight windows. And against Wisconsin, he looked pretty terrible, I thought. Oh,
yeah. Well, the fact that not only he, but, I mean, just the entire team, in terms of they weren't able to run the ball. Obviously, they weren't able to score. It was just, it was just a, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Mike Valenti up in Michigan, but has a radio program. He's basically saying, this is the end for the Mark D'Antonio era. So that might be a little harsh, but it certainly did not look good for the Spartans against Wisconsin.
Yeah. So the Spartans at this point, Chip, are 4-3, 2-2 in the Big Ten. But they really look to have fallen off. I know that Mark D'Antonio, by the way, that was 38-0 was the final score if you missed it. Mark D'Antonio was asked after the game if he, in hindsight, should have made some changes in the offensive coaching staff. And he, in his normal curmudgeonly style, basically deflected and didn't own up to the fact that he rearranged the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting. I'm fairly certain that Michigan State, that they are off this weekend, so they that much that Open Date that Ohio State suffered through like a loss in the polls, so to speak, or I should say that they fell down in the polls. But in all seriousness, this might just be what the doctor ordered. I'm not disagreeing with you that. This D'Antonio has only himself to blame because, as you said, quite accurately, I might add, that, just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, he put himself and his program in this situation. It's going to be interesting to see because I believe on October 26th, that is when Penn State comes to town, and that's going to be a 3:30 game. So that's going to be the kind of thing where, okay, well, let's see if they've improved, if they've gotten healthy, if they've done all of the above, that they're going to be better situated when the Nittany Lions come to town.
And honestly, if it weren't for a late touchdown or late score against Indiana, Mark D'Antonio might already have been fired this year.
I don't know if they're going to fire him though. I think they're going to try to persuade him to go. I mean, I just think, he's already got the career. He's got the career in wins at Michigan State, and at Mike Valenti, I was just listening to his rant prior to us recording, and he made a very fair point. Mark D'Antonio is going to be 65 years old when the season kicks off next year, and I'm not being discriminatory about the age. It's just that if you're expecting Mark D'Antonio to all of a sudden embrace, the spread offense attack and start throwing the ball, I mean, that's not going to happen. I mean, he is who he is. So I just wonder if Michigan State, if they're going to be able to persuade him, because I know he's had some heart issues in the past, and that this is in the best interest of the program, moving forward, to kind of get some fresh blood in there. I'm not sure what direction they might go. I believe Mike Valenti was tossing around Luke Fickell's name, and we've kind of casually suggested Luke Fickell would be a great fit up there. But it remains to be seen what direction Michigan State chooses to go. I just don't know if they ever will fire him. I mean, I think things would have to really go off the rails in order for that to happen. But maybe you might be onto something.
Maybe the directive came from the department. Maybe he wasn't permitted to spend money on assistants. Maybe he went in and said, "I'd really like to have some money to spend on some offensive assistant coaches." Maybe he was told no, and we really don't know. We don't have access to that kind of information. So it's possible that maybe he did try to do something and wasn't permitted to do that. And he's not the kind of guy who would throw Michigan State, his employer, under the bus like that.
That's a really good point. I just kind of think, I mean, when you think about it, like Tressel, being a Tressel disciple, so to speak, Tressel, when he lost assistants, it's because they went to other jobs. You know what I mean? Like when, he lost Mark D'Antonio, for example, like that's a classic example of that. But he didn't fire anyone. And a lot of those offensive assistants that are kind of keeping Michigan State stuck in neutral or worse, they were with Mark D'Antonio when he was an assistant at Ohio State. We're talking about the, noted war criminal Jim Bowman and, some of the other people. But in all seriousness, it's one of those things where maybe loyalty is actually to his detriment. The fact that, as you said, he kept these guys around. So now he's reaping what he sowed, so to speak. And what he's sowing is the last two games, they've scored 10 points and they've given up 72. So they're looking pretty bleak.
Very un-Spartan-like. It would be nice, though, to have Mark D'Antonio back in scarlet and gray as a special advisor to the coaching staff at Ohio State.
I say what you will about the curmudgeon ways. All I know is the guys that played for him, like Bobby Carpenter, AJ Hawk, that played underneath him, they raved about him as a defensive coach.
He's still a fantastic defensive mind. I mean, even though, you look at that 38-0 and think, well, how good could they have been? Well, no defense is going to be good when the offense can't move the ball and you're put under that kind of stress repeatedly. And this isn't his best defensive unit personnel-wise that he's had since he's been there. It's not as good as a few years ago. We talk about a few years back when the defensive backfield was very highly rated and they were known as the no-fly zone. And as I said on Saturday, it's now the go ahead and fly zone.
Yeah, I mean the recruiting's falling off, the player development. I mean there's just a lot of areas that need, like I said, they need a fresh approach. Whether or not Mark D'Antonio makes that decision, and hopefully if that is the decision he wants to make, because I think he's earned it. And my personal belief is, it's something that I think he has a true love and respect of Michigan State. for everything that they have given him throughout his career, that maybe he will make that decision hopefully before the end of the season, which would allow the Spartans to get a jump start on not only their coaching search, but also maybe kind of reinvigorate their recruiting efforts.
Yeah, it's a shame that he never grasped the Urban Meyer method of finding head coaching jobs for the coaches that weren't doing very well. So you could say, well, I didn't fire him. He took a head coach's job. Okay, let's go with that. I think we all remember like Everett Withers and guys like that who left Ohio State, and suddenly they were a head coach at a small school somewhere. And meanwhile, Ohio State was the better for having jettisoned some of those coaches along the way. But yeah, it's been an ugly couple of weeks for Sparty, especially the way that the Spartans started that game at Ohio State, and I think they just got beaten up by two very physical offensive lines in back-to-back weeks on the road. And I mean, that was a tough road schedule for Michigan State, and maybe they'll bounce back after a bye week. And but we will have to see. I think right now they look like I wouldn't even really pick them against Michigan, and we'll get to Michigan in a moment. The other game I wanted to see this week, and it was another East-West game, was Penn State at Iowa. And this game is one that, I mean, Penn State kind of got jobbed a few times in it. And Nate Stanley, to me, Chip, is terrible. But but Iowa hung around all day long and in the end lost 17-12 at home. And it was a much closer game than probably Penn State fans would have liked. And, you know, for all the things that Iowa did poorly against Michigan, well, they still did a lot of that stuff poorly against Penn State. But at least they kept the game close again. And, you know, in the end, Penn State now bowl eligible 6-0, and Iowa 4-2, and in real trouble in the Big Ten West.
Yeah, I mean, Iowa is one of those places where, and we talked about it last week when we kind of had that brief preview of this game. I mean, it's a tough place to play, as any Ohio State fan can regrettably remember from a couple years ago. Penn State in previous years, Michigan in previous years. I mean, it's not the kind of place where you want to play, especially at night. I agree with you. I think Penn State was robbed in certain circumstances, but we'll see if Iowa has enough in the tank to kind of bounce back. Like you said, I mean, it's definitely not looking good for them as it relates to the divisional race. Now, Penn State, on the other hand, I mean, they've got some big games. I mean, we were just talking about Michigan State, but they've got a really big one. They've got their whiteout game, which big surprise. You know, they're playing Michigan. I mean, it's like you can pretty much set your clock to, you know, who's their big opponent for the year is how they're going to determine what their whiteout game is. So I think Penn State, they're looking pretty good, but they still have some challenges to address before they come to Columbus at the end of November.
Yeah, as watching that game against Iowa, I was more impressed with Penn State leading up to the Iowa game than I kind of left the Iowa game feeling about them. But as you said, you know, Iowa can kind of drag you down. They're one of those teams that kind of can drag you down to their level at times, and it certainly was a kind of an ugly Big Ten game in that respect in Iowa City. You and I talked this last week, and we talked about the East versus the West. Now that you've seen these games, Wisconsin, Michigan State, and Penn State, Iowa, do you have an updated thought on, is the West catching up to the East?
Man, you're just trying to pin me down on this one. I'll tell you what, I'm still liking the East for all of, right now it looks to me like you've got Ohio State and Wisconsin are the class of the Big Ten, and Penn State, now granted, I mean, they weren't super impressive and flashy in their win against Iowa, but Penn State in comparison to the next best teams in the West, I know that you're going to throw Minnesota at me. I know that. I can feel it. Tremor in the force kind of a thing. But in all seriousness, I think the East is still better.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not trying to get you to commit one way or another because I don't even know. I mean, if you pin me down and say, is the West catching up to the East? I would say more that there's some teams in the East that are regressing. That's what I would say.
Well, Michigan State falls in that category.
Yeah,
and Michigan for sure.
And Michigan, yes. I think that's part of it. And even Penn State is not probably as good this year, but they shouldn't be expected to. They're rebuilding a little bit after, losing some really top guys, especially a top quarterback. Let's get on with another East-West game. The Michigan Wolverines jumped out to a 28-0 lead on Illinois. And then before you knew it, in the fourth quarter, Illinois had made this a field goal game. It was kind of a funny game to watch, and by funny I mean there were a lot of plays that made me laugh out loud on both sides of the ball. And in the end, Michigan gets a 42-25 win that looks more lopsided than it was.
I said this last week, and I'm not taking back anything that I stated last week, and that is I thought as a result of this game that the Wolverines were going to come out of this with false confidence about where they are and what direction they're going. And the mere fact, as you said, that they jumped out to a 28-0 lead and then turned it into only a field goal lead late in the game. Now, granted, Illinois turned the ball over, which kind of near the end, which contributed to those late scores. Mm-hmm. I do not anticipate the Wolverines having equal success when they go to Happy Valley this weekend. I think they are going to get beaten like a rented mule, personally, by Penn State.
For all of the foibles that Michigan has had this year, they still managed to get to 5-1 and 3-1 in the Big Ten.
Yeah, but let's see how that continues over the next few weeks. I think I don't anticipate it being the next 2 weeks. I do not anticipate being very pleasant for the citizens of Ann Arbor. Right. I think Penn State is going to be as difficult a place to play. Those whiteout conditions. Ohio State fans are well used to that. This is a Michigan offense that is just terrible. I mean, in terms of turnovers, in terms of fumbles. I mean, like in terms of the passing game, running game. I mean, they are not well coordinated by any stretch. And then I think next week when they are at home, they have Notre Dame coming into town. So I just don't see. I know that and I'm not disagreeing with you. The fact that they're 5-1, I think the wheels are going to start to slow down even more so up in Ann Arbor in terms of the positive momentum that they have going right now.
Yeah, they definitely have a backloaded, tough schedule, but it does at least look like they may be out of danger of not becoming bowl eligible, which is something we just talked about a few weeks ago.
Sure. I mean, because one of those opponents that they get is Maryland.
Yeah, and they survived the Iowa game, and that's one that we thought that if Iowa came in there and dealt them a loss, that could affect their bowl eligibility if, with the fact that they still have to play Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan State, and Notre Dame. And now now after we've seen Michigan State a few weeks, they don't look as daunting or as threatening, and that will probably still be a very close, very low scoring game, but I'm not convinced that Michigan State's better than Michigan, and that doesn't really say a lot of good things about Michigan State.
No. Like I said, I think it's going to be an interesting last month of the season.
Yeah. All right, so Indiana went to Rutgers, Rutgers went to Indiana, and it didn't go well. Rutgers may as well have stayed home and not lost 35-0. Indiana, again, jumping out to 4 wins in their quest to become bowl eligible. Do they have 2 more wins in them this year?
I think they do, and one of them, I know we're going to talk about the upcoming games. I think one of them will be this weekend when they travel to Maryland. I think Maryland is kind of starting to fall apart themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of Rutgers, I mean, that they may as well just, okay, is there a way for them to just forfeit the rest of their games? I mean, because I don't see how. I'm joking, of course, but I don't see how Ohio State is going to keep this under 60 points, even with their backups, when they go there in the middle of November, because I mean, this team is just, even one of the beat writers for Rutgers I saw on Twitter suggested this might be one of the worst teams in Big Ten history. And that's saying something.
It's really a bad team. I mean, they're 1-5, and that one win came very early in the season against another clown show opponent. And Indiana had no trouble. Michael Penix threw for 282 yards and 3 touchdowns. Indiana, not a great rushing team, but Stevie Scott got 164 yards on the ground, and Whop Philyor caught 10 balls for 182. It was never close, 21-0 after the first quarter, and Rutgers is maybe more Rutgers than ever.
Yeah, the same beat writer that I was just describing, in his estimation, it's not that he was suggesting that Rutgers should not have fired Chris Ash, but in his opinion, it is kind of, he's truly second-guessing the administration's decision to fire Chris Ash at this point of the season, as well as the offensive coordinator. I believe his name is John McNulty, who was fired because they took a very bad situation and somehow made it even worse on both sides of the ball. I mean, the offense now is really sputtering, and the defense is completely falling apart. So it just kind of makes you wonder what the end goal result what they're going to be, now that basically, okay, the administration has thrown in the towel, and the players, you can see by the results on the field, have done the same.
Well, to put it in wrestling terms, I think we all know what's coming next, and that is, by God, that's Graciano's music.
Well, anytime that they want to make that announcement to try and create some kind of a spark of enthusiasm in New Jersey, I'm sure it would be welcomely appreciated.
All right, let's stay with the Big Ten East cripples, and Maryland gets waxed 40-14 by Purdue. I don't know what quarterback Purdue is on now, but it really doesn't matter when you're playing Maryland. Maryland looked like world beaters for 2 weeks, and then became like last year's Rutgers.
And this was a surprise, personally. I mean, I'm not suggesting that I thought Purdue was hanging up the season, but I know that they were dealing with a lot of injuries. So for them to come out and basically take Maryland behind the woodshed as impressively as they did, I mean, that speaks, I think, volumes about the kind of program that they're trying to build in Purdue. I'm not suggesting that they're going to go on a tear and become bowl eligible, but it's nice to see that somebody has some pride.
Yeah, quarterback Jack Plummer looked like Jake the Snake Plummer from his Arizona State days, throwing for 420 yards and 3 touchdowns against the Terrapins defense.
That's impressive. And like you said, I think Maryland, they're just kind of going back into their, they're going back into the mindset of, all right, can we finish up the season as soon as possible? Because, as you said, the impressive 2-0 start is becoming a faint, distant memory.
Indeed it is, and had it not been for Rutgers, Maryland would maybe only have those 2 wins to show for their season this year, the way things are looking. That brings us to a team that the wheels are kind of falling off for as well, but this time it's injury-related, and that's the Nebraska Cornhuskers, who went to Minnesota and got pounded 34-7. When I say pounded, I kind of mean literally, because the Gophers were able to run the football quite effectively against them. Rodney Smith had 139 yards. They kind of just ran all over Nebraska and wore them down. 20-point third quarter really did it. And Nebraska is the walking wounded. I mean, you got Adrian Martinez injured. You've got Wandale Robinson got injured in this game. So, Nebraska's skill players, which was really the thing that kept the team in games, once they start going down, I'm not really sure what Scott Frost has left in the cupboard right now.
Yeah, I mean, and that prediction I had of Nebraska winning the Big Ten West is looking worse and worse as the weeks progress. But I want to give some credit to PJ Fleck, the fighting PJ Flecks of Minnesota. I mean, here I am thinking he's just kind of, like a big, kind of like snake oil salesman, so to speak, in terms of like with all the rah-rah and enthusiasm. Here he has Minnesota 6-0. Now, granted, some of those wins were literally, by the skin of their teeth. But as you said, I mean, they pounded Nebraska. They're going to a bowl. I don't know which one, but it's the kind of thing where when you look at Minnesota's schedule, I mean, they're going to be playing that hapless Rutgers team this coming weekend. So there's another win for Minnesota. And I want to say that in a couple weeks, I think Penn State travels out to Minnesota. So that might be the rare night game in Minnesota, with Penn State going on the road to take on what could probably be an undefeated Golden Gopher squad.
Yeah, did you check the rankings? Are the Gophers now ranked?
They are ranked. They were ranked near the bottom of the top 25 last week. I did not see what their ranking is heading into this week's game at Rutgers, but I know that I want to say that they were like 24 or 25 last week. So based on that impressive performance, I would hope that they had moved up at least a couple spots.
Yeah, I would think so. Especially since Texas A&M, the 3-loss team now, was
sure.
right around the bottom of that top 25 as well. Tanner Morgan only threw 13 passes in this game for Minnesota. He completed 8 of them for 128 yards and a touchdown, and really didn't even need to throw the football. Rodney Smith, as I mentioned, 139 yards. Shannon Brooks went for 99 more. Mohamed Ibrahim, 84 more yards. So like everybody that carried the ball from Minnesota just basically took off and had no trouble with the Nebraska defense. Nebraska, meanwhile, used Noah Vedral as the quarterback for Martinez. He didn't have a great day, 14 out of 23 for 135 yards. They also brought in Andrew Bunch to throw a few passes. He didn't throw a bunch of passes, but Andrew Bunch was 1 of 6. So this was not a good day for Nebraska. Vedral was also the Vedral, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I can't remember, but because I was flipping around and sometimes I didn't even have the sound on. But he was their leading rusher, 15 carries for 49 yards, and it was just a pretty terrible day for Nebraska all around, especially when you consider the injury to Wandale Robinson, very promising freshman.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where Scott Frost has the program in the right direction, but they don't have the depth. As you said, when you had to bring in the backup quarterbacks and you saw the end result of that decision, it just kind of goes to show, how much further this rebuild has to go. So I will point the finger, squarely at myself in terms of, buying too much into the hype of the good feelings that Scott Frost is creating. All it would take is, that injury to Adrian Martinez, as Nebraska can point to themselves and say, okay, we really don't have much behind, Adrian Martinez. So I think Scott Frost is moving in the right direction, but I think that they're still kind of in the land of mediocrity.
All right. Well, that game between Minnesota and Wisconsin is going to be a fun one, I think.
Oh, easily.
That's
without
a Fun rivalry game, especially if both teams enter that game without a loss. That's going to be, the game to watch in the Big Ten West this year. And I think I had picked Iowa to win the Big Ten West, and you had picked Nebraska. So it looks like we're both going to be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was one of those things where, as I said a moment ago, I was kind of buying into the hype. You can obviously speak for yourself, but the Iowa pick, was certainly made sense because, as we all know, like it seems like, every so often Iowa just comes out of nowhere and has a good year. And who would have known that Wisconsin was going to come out and be pitching, its fourth shutout in 6 games, type of defense and so I mean, like I said, I think the West is a difficult thing to forecast. I mean, there are a lot of teams that you just kind of would look at preseason and think, okay, well, based on who they have coming back and based on the schedules and all those kind of things that you use, like I said, like it's a type of thing where it's a difficult forecast, but I think pretty much Wisconsin is squarely and certainly in the driver's seat for the Big Ten West.
Yeah, sure, for sure. I was not buying Paul Chryst, and I certainly undersold it because he's having a great year. He's really got the defense playing well. He's got the offensive line playing extremely well, which you expect from Wisconsin. But and also replacing the quarterback. So he's been able to do all of those things this year. I think we expected more out of Purdue, but they've had some injury problems, and it's just not. It's not come together, and I think Iowa's had it all there to take. They had a Michigan and a Penn State game that they had kind of their style game, and they couldn't capitalize because their quarterback's not very good.
No, and that's the thing is those are both of those kind of games. I'm still, like not so much about Penn State because I just think Penn State, kind of you alluded to it earlier. Penn State seemed much more in control than Michigan ever did in their win over Iowa. So I think that Michigan game, that's the one that kind of you're going to be, if you're an Iowa fan, you're going to be thinking, man, how did we ever blow such what should have been, and I don't want to say an easy win, but easier than some of the games that they still have to play, such as Wisconsin.
Yeah, and the other thing that Iowa has done poorly this year is their play calling's been terrible. Their play calling against Penn State was it was almost like someone who had never watched a football game was getting to call the plays. It was, and I was watching the Iowa writers in my timeline just absolutely lose their mind. The Iowa bloggers were just losing their minds at some of these play calls, and I couldn't blame them. I mean, I would have been just as angry if as they were if my team had been doing some of the things that they were doing. So, not a great outing for Iowa. So I missed on that pick, but it's really going to come down to, it appears, unless some things go wrong, it looks like it's going to come down to Wisconsin and Minnesota, that game, and I think. I mean, I would suspect Wisconsin is the better team. It certainly has looked that way. But I'm not going to count Goldie out, especially in a rivalry game.
No, I mean, the way that they're playing so far, I mean, I think Minnesota, I mean, you want to talk about another interesting, test is, with Minnesota, when they host Penn State, what kind of game that they're able to do there, that might say, hey, this could be the team that has a decent shot against Wisconsin. I don't believe that's going to be the case, but I do think Minnesota, I mean, they are certainly much more improved than I certainly gave them credit for at the beginning of the season.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chip, the teams that were off this week, obviously Northwestern and Ohio State, they'll play each other this Friday. That's right, I said Friday. I'm not happy that I said Friday, but that's when the game is. So we have to live with that and have a Friday football game. So I guess we're I don't know, a high school league now, or maybe a MAC thing or Mountain West. I don't know, but this doesn't seem like Big Ten football.
No, and as much as I voice my displeasure over the alternate uniforms, I'll wear them every day of the week and twice on Sunday versus a Friday night football game, because to me that's how sacred I think within Ohio. I can't speak obviously for within other states of the union, but I just know Ohio high school football, that's one of the the hallmarks of the Midwest, is the communities going out and supporting the local high school team. And that's not to say that, like the other states, that don't have Big Ten teams, that they don't care for high school football or anything like that. But I just think there are certain things that, when it comes to Friday nights, letting the high schools have, I don't want to call it even the spotlight, but the attention, if you will, that letting them have that. And this, just everything in the pursuit of the almighty dollar that Jim Delaney sacrificed with this decision. And he deserved all of the criticism and all of the venom, from what I understand from the Ohio High School Football Coaches Association, among others, that was directed towards him. Like it just basically, it seemed as though he made this decision without ever contemplating or consulting the members of the conference, and all of the vitriol that has been thrown in his way, I think, is well deserved.
Jim Delaney, SEC sleeper agent.
Yeah, I just know that, for all of the people that have tried to suggest, oh, this is good for the Big Ten, for the programs that need that kind of attention. All right, then, if that's what you truly believe, then how about you put it to a vote and let those programs play on Friday night? I can assure you that Ohio State would not be one of them,
right,
if given the option. Penn State and Michigan have also been very vocal about that, and I just think it's a bad decision. It looks, it looked bad when it was announced, and I know that Ohio State, unfortunately, is going to have to, kind of abide by the decision. I'm presuming that it's always going to be that Ohio State, when they do have to do this, they're going to be the road team, because I can't imagine what it would be like in Columbus on a Friday night with all of the high school games, let alone with an Ohio State game. I mean, I just think it was a terrible decision.
Yeah, I mean, if it was a home game for Ohio State, they would lose a recruiting game. They would not be able to have recruits in on a Friday night because the recruits would be playing, and they, it doesn't matter as much when they're on the road because they can't host recruits on a road game, but it's still affecting teams that play on these Friday night games. So I think you're right. It's a bad idea. Shouldn't have done it, but we're stuck with it. So I guess we'll talk a little bit more about Northwestern and Ohio State in just a little bit. Before we move on to some of the other games that took place this week, I want to just mention that you were right. I think that you predicted that Ohio State Wisconsin would be Big Nude Saturday.
Well, that was basically born out of that whole announcement months ago that Fox made, that what they consider, all right, what, as you referred to it, like their Big Noon Saturday, whatever is the biggest game. That's, I think, how they determine what's going to be kicked off at noon. And then the other aspect to that was the fact that Fox is also televising the World Series. That will be, or should be, Game 4 of the World Series, I believe. So the fact that Fox was already obligated for a night game, Notre Dame's going to be at Michigan, which is going to be televised on ABC. So just by process of elimination, I thought, something, Fox is going to probably be showing that at noon. So I'm just glad that they made it official.
Yeah, I would have liked it to have been a nighttime ABC or ESPN game on Saturday night instead of Big Nude, not noon, nude, Big Nude Saturday is what we've got going on. So Ohio State, Wisconsin is a noon kickoff on Big Nude Saturday.
Yeah, that should be, now that's going to be one of those, I'm just going to say in advance that's just going to be, I will probably be among my most non-productive days of the year. My wife doesn't know this, but sitting there, starting, with the Ohio State Wisconsin game, we already talked about how Michigan State's kind of in a tailspin, but that's when I believe Penn State comes to town, and then at the end of the night, Notre Dame at Michigan. So it's going to be, pretty much kind of following the Michael Citro plan of, like almost like a 12-hour day of gauntlet of football. I'm looking forward to it.
I swear by it, and I don't recommend anyone ever do anything else. All right, so aside from the Big Ten games, Chip, there were some pretty marquee matchups around the country this week, and one of the games, of course, that was got the most focus and attention this weekend wasn't one that we expected to get a lot of focus and attention on, but because of the outcome, it ended up getting all of the focus and attention, and that is Georgia losing at home to South Carolina 20-17 in a game that, quite frankly, South Carolina should have won it in regulation. Got a little bit of home cooking for Georgia that allowed the Bulldogs to tie that game late, and then South Carolina tried to not win it several times but ended up winning it anyway, almost by default, in a battle of college kickers in overtime. Muschamp and Kirby Smart trying to out-Muschamp each other, and in the end, Kirby Smart out-Muschamped Muschamp and lost the game. This is a game, I will point out, that it featured Will Muschamp deciding that a 58-yard field goal was a higher percentage play than going for a 4th and 3.
Yeah, that was very perplexing at watching that. That was, I mentioned earlier the birthday of my best friend. When we were watching that, I truly thought, and I realized South Carolina had their backup quarterback in, but that player, and his name escapes me. I know that Ryan Helinski, the starting quarterback for South Carolina, was out with a knee injury, so they were making do with the backup. But
Dakarian Joyner.
Okay, thank you. So Joyner showed certainly a very effective mobility that I thought giving him a run-pass option on 4th and 3 certainly made more sense than trying a long field goal. At the end, it did seem as though, like, Will Muschamp, granted with the aid of some very peculiar calls by the officials, was doing everything that he could to give that game to Georgia. But I'm certainly very happy that the Gamecocks were able to upset Georgia at home.
Yeah, that was pretty good to see. It was interesting. I would say that it has national championship implications, but we all know that's not true because Georgia, and I joked about this on Saturday, and even though it wasn't really a joke, that it's going to be great when Georgia's still ranked in the top 4 and suddenly South Carolina's a top 10 team at 500.
Yeah, I think the nice thing is for Ohio State fans is that at this stage of the season, the way Ohio State's playing, I think the national media is giving Ohio State their due respect. Wisconsin's starting to certainly gain a lot more attention. And as far as Georgia goes, one of the games that I think a lot of people are kind of, presuming that it's going to be, Georgia can win the rest of their games and get back into the playoff hunt. They have to go, I believe they have to go to Auburn in the middle of November. So it's entirely possible they could be eliminated in terms of, like the national title discussion well before the SEC championship. I mean, they still have to play Florida. Like I said, they have to play Auburn. I think Georgia, there's certainly enough time for them to get back in it, but there's a lot of games, especially that LSU Alabama game, November 9th, I think that are going to have national title implications for the SEC.
Yeah, I'm not that impressed with Auburn, but the Florida game will be interesting from the perspective that if Georgia plays offensively, and if Jake Fromm specifically has a game like he did against South Carolina, where he missed some guys. I mean, he was throwing behind guys throughout the day. If he has a day like that against the Florida defense, he's going to be in a little bit of trouble. Sticking with the SEC, and speaking of Florida, the night game with Florida at LSU was a fun game to watch. Of course, if you're an Ohio State fan, you were watching that to check out Joe Burrow and see how he would do, and it turns out he would do just fine. The Gators came in with a top 6 defense in the country, and LSU had no problems moving the football. I mean, they had a 130-yard rusher with a 57-yard run. They had Joe Burrow throwing for 293 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, only threw 3 incompletions on the night, and they had really no trouble moving the football and scoring on that tough Gator defense to the tune of 42 points. The Gators put up 28, and I saw a lot of people say, ooh, Kyle Trask is really impressive, and this offense is a lot better than we thought. Florida did that against the number 31 defense in the country. LSU's defense is fool's gold. Everybody's used to the LSU defense being good because it's usually good. This year it's not that good.
Yeah, I'm happy for Joe Burrow that he's having a spectacular year and for all of the positive accolades that he's receiving. I agree with you that LSU, the defense, it's so unusual because that's usually been the strength of the team. It's a complete role reversal this year for LSU with Joe Burrow and the offense being center stage, and the defense is not nearly as dominant as we have grown to expect.
Yeah, that's what makes me think that LSU won't come out of the SEC, because at some point the offense is going to have a tough night, and the defense is just not good enough to make up for it.
Well, that's what I mean. It's weird to think about, but that November 9th game, a few weeks from now, when they play Alabama, that might, dare I say, it might be a shootout, because Alabama's defense isn't nearly as dominant as they have been in previous years under Nick Saban. So offensively, Alabama looks very, very tough, but their defense is not nearly what we've come to expect. So that should be an interesting game. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it might be difficult. I just think it's very, very peculiar to see LSU and Alabama be stronger on the offensive side of the ball versus the defensive.
Mm-hmm. It was a little annoying though, Saturday night, Chip, for me watching Trayvon Grimes make plays for a school other than Ohio State.
Yeah, but I'm glad that Ohio State did the right thing for that young man, especially with everything that he was going on in his personal life. That's hopefully the kind of thing that other schools would take note of. That when a transfer request comes in to do what's best for the player and not necessarily try to restrict or hold the player back, no matter how much Ohio State would have loved to have kept him. I think it's great to see that Grimes is doing well for Florida.
Mm-hmm. Another big game we saw this week, the Red River rivalry game between Oklahoma and Texas. And this game early on, especially the first half, was a lot lower scoring than I expected it to. It was only 10-3 at the half. It ended up an Oklahoma victory 34-27. Oklahoma really wasn't in too much danger in the second half. They ended up getting a 2-score lead. Texas cut it to 1 a couple times, but it was a tight game, and you would expect this kind of game in a rivalry game. But I think it may have shown some weaknesses in Oklahoma, and also, I mean, the Texas defense tackled Rutgers at times in this game.
Well, the nice thing about the way that the Big 12 handles their conference championships, we'll probably get a chance to see this again. With Oklahoma and Texas, in terms of being the top two teams, since they don't really have divisions within the Big 12. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of, for all of the hype that it received, it was somewhat lackluster, I would say.
Yeah. All right. The other game that was, had top, sort of playoff implications, if you will, Notre Dame hosting USC, and it looked like USC was going to get run out of the building, and then the Trojans made a game of it with a backup quarterback and ended up, I think it's a backup of a backup of a backup quarterback at this point for USC, and the final only 30-27, not a convincing win for Notre Dame.
No. And that's the thing. I just think Notre Dame, they might have been looking beyond USC, just knowing that they've got big games, coming up in terms of I'm not necessarily, of the opinion that that they are going to dominate Michigan, but that might be something that they might be looking forward to. But no excuse for, like you said, not taking care of business against USC. I mean, they should have won that game much more easily than they did.
Mm-hmm. And congrats to Luke Fickell, who keeps rolling on. Win at Houston, 38-23. So the Bearcats are 5-1, with the only loss coming at Ohio Stadium.
And his phone is going to be ringing considerably this offseason, regardless of whether he decides to take those calls to look into anything beyond where he is, because I know that, he's an Ohio guy through and through, and that's part of what attracted him to that Cincinnati opportunity. But if a Big Ten job or anything else that kind of suits what he believes where he could be possibly successful, he's going to have a decision to make.
Mm-hmm. And, it's great about Luke Fickell being able to do this is he's been, he hasn't even been able to get a full 4 years of his own recruits in yet. So it's been just a couple of years, and he's been able to make great strides there. So, you're right. I think he's going to be getting a lot of job offers, a lot of interviews this off season. Before we wrap up this week's show by talking about the our picks to click and our score predictions for the Northwestern game, a couple other little tidbits. The Buckeyes got a commitment today, Chip, from Ryan Watts, a defensive back, cornerback in the 2020 class. So that's the 24th commitment for the 2020 class, and he's a guy out of Texas who was formerly committed to Oklahoma. So this is another very talented win for the Ohio State staff in the recruiting department.
Yeah, Watts was originally verbally committed to Oklahoma, and he rescinded his verbal commitment, came up to visit recently for Ohio State. From what I understand, kind of a like a taller kid, I think, 6'2", 6'3". So the great thing about this recruiting class, and obviously we've got some time to go before the early signing period begins in December, is when you look at, as you said, he is the 24th verbal commitment. Just looking at the list of names of the players who are verbally committed, he is the fourth defensive back that Ohio State has. Legend Cavazos, Clark Phillips, and Lathan Ransom, and I believe of those four, Ransom is a safety. The other three play corner. But from what I have been able to gather, that this is the kind of thing that the Ohio State coaching staff wanted, a full complement of defensive backs, because unfortunately they're going to be losing some very talented defensive backs this coming off season. So they need to restock the shelves, so to speak, and they're off to a tremendous start with the players that they have been able to secure with verbal commitments.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to think that the Buckeyes could lose all of Jordan Fuller, Jeffrey Okudah, Damon Arnett, and Shaun Wade all in 1 year.
Well, it's the kind of thing where of those, like you just rattled off, like how scary that is. Shaun Wade has been, and he's been playing well. I'm not trying to take anything away from him. It's going to be, he's going to have a decision to make, in terms of if he continues to play well, does he want to play one more year and try to improve his draft stock, or does he just want to, okay, I'm going to go and, and it really depends on what the scouts and the general managers and coaches think at the NFL level. Unfortunately, Ohio State, they're going to lose Fuller. They're going to lose Damon Arnett, just due to eligibility. And then, Jeffrey Okudah is pretty much like a surefire top 10, talent at corner. So like you said, it's scary to think about that they might possibly be losing four talented defensive backs in one offseason.
Can we get Chris Carter to give Shaun Wade a call this offseason?
I don't know if he has the same kind of pull and influence, but I'm not against it if that's what you're asking.
All right. It was a big weekend again for Ohio State players in the NFL. You got to see Carlos Hyde have a big day for the Texans. You got to see Terry McLaurin with a 2-touchdown game to help my Dolphins stay in pole position for that number one draft choice, who I'm starting to think maybe it shouldn't be Tua, but maybe Joe Burrow. And you had a big day from Marshawn Lattimore, who basically shut down the entire Jacksonville Jaguar passing game.
Yeah, if anything, when you talk about recruiting, nothing helps the recruiting more than for these players to see the success that the players who have gone through the program and onto the NFL that they're having. I mean, nothing can be a stronger recruiting pitch than to see kind of the results on the field on NFL Sundays.
Mm-hmm. All right, Chip, the Buckeyes are traveling to Evanston this week, and Northwestern's one of those teams that, as Tom Orr says, can get you into a rock fight and kind of drag you down to their level a little bit. But I don't know what Pat Fitzgerald's team is going to look like this weekend against the Buckeyes when it's all said and done. I know that they're a team that has struggled to score points and move the football. They've had some quarterback problems. T.J. Green getting hurt early in the season. They've had Aiden Smith and Hunter Johnson splitting some time. Each getting some games. Both of those individuals have 1 touchdown pass and 4 interceptions. Both of them under 50% completion rating. I don't anticipate Northwestern being able to run the football against the Buckeyes, so that could be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to single out what is the biggest problem that Northwestern has had offensively, is that going into this season, I think they put a lot of their eggs in the basket of Hunter Johnson. He was highly touted recruit, in terms of the recruiting rankings, a 5-star prospect. He went to Clemson before he, decided to transfer and come back closer to home to play for Northwestern. And from the onset, when you look at how Northwestern has done this year, I mean, they've only won against UNLV in the second week of the season, but they've just struggled so much offensively. I know that they've been, trying to build up their offense with, they have Aiden Smith as another quarterback option, but they're just not able to effectively pass the ball, running the ball. They've got some talent there. You talk about, Drake Anderson and at one running back, and if you want to feel old, because this makes me feel old, he's the son of Damian Anderson. I don't know if you remember him.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. But yeah, so yeah, kind of makes me feel old. But getting back to it, I mean, offensively, like you said, they have difficulty running the ball. I mean, it's very, very interesting to kind of speculate as to what their game plan is going to be when Ohio State comes to town on Friday night.
Yeah, I think they're going to have to just be sound defensively, try to keep everything in front of them, try to make Ohio State beat them with long drives rather than big plays. And that's how they can maybe frustrate the Buckeyes and try to take advantage of that. Offensively, I just don't expect a whole lot from Northwestern in this game. They're leading 2 rushers, Drake Anderson and Isaiah Bowser, together have about half as many yards as J.K. Dobbins. So it's not like Anderson's been fine. He's averaging almost 5 yards a carry, but 366 yards on 74 attempts, and Bowser has 103 yards on 29 attempts, and those guys haven't been able to be healthy and play all the games either. They're they've just struggled. They've struggled to be consistent, put consistent lineups out there. Anderson is a freshman and Bowser is a sophomore, so it's not like they're experienced backs anyway. The offensive line hasn't been as good. The quarterbacking situation has been a problem. So I expect that Ohio State should be able to shut down Northwestern's offense. And even if they have some struggles early moving the ball, I expect that Ohio State should be able to pick up the pace as the game goes on and be able to wear down Northwestern.
Yeah, I mean, I respect Northwestern immensely. Last year in the Big Ten championship, Ohio State jumped out to, a big lead and Northwestern clawed back, and obviously Ohio State was able to win the game. But, when I look at Northwestern, yeah, like you said, I think that analogy that Tom uses, kind of like they kind of get you into, like that rock fight. They were blown out. Ironically, they were blown out by Michigan State, and probably Michigan State's most impressive game this season. But most of their, you want to talk about the rock fight mentality. At Wisconsin, they lost, by 9, 24-15. They lost on a last-second field goal at Nebraska in their last game, 13-10. So, I mean, they are certainly capable of kind of slowing down the game and frustrating you, but I just don't think that they can do that effectively for 60 minutes against a team as talented as Ohio State.
Have we seen a Friday night weather report yet, Chip?
I have not. Thank you for asking that. That's a legitimately good question. Considering it's an 8:30 kickoff, in Evanston, I would expect, just because it's that time of year, I would expect it to be a nice, brisk, crisp fall evening. Like I would guess, by the time that game kicks off, like you're talking 40-ish, like high, like 45 degrees, I would think. Just that's kind of what the weather is around here in the Ohio area that I'm speaking to you from. So that would be my guess, but no, I have no idea if it's supposed to rain or if it's supposed to be colder than that.
That could be a bit of an equalizer, a bit of a wild card to throw into the deck. But because you and I have talked about it, and maybe, we expect Justin Fields, maybe when the weather isn't quite as good, to maybe not be as sharp, and that could be some problem, create some problems for the offense. Although we said that at the beginning of the season before we knew J.K. Dobbins was going to be back to being J.K. Dobbins again. So maybe it won't have quite as big of an impact. Defensively for Northwestern, Chip, you're going to hear the name Patty Fisher. You're going to hear the name Joe Gaziano. These are guys that are going to make tackles and be around the ball. They're, Patty Fisher's a junior linebacker. Gaziano is a senior defensive lineman. They are the two top tackle for loss guys on Northwestern. They make plays. They are able to shoot gaps. They're able to get pressure on quarterbacks and that kind of thing. So that's what you're going to see, I think, on that side of the football. I will say that I didn't expect to see the number 15 tackler on Northwestern to be quarterback Aiden Smith with 4 solo tackles and 1 assist.
Yeah, I mean, Gaziano, I'm glad you brought him up. I mean, he's listed, I think, around like 280 pounds. So at first glance, you think, okay, this guy, Ohio State's going to be able to blow him off the ball. But like you said, he is their best pass rusher. He's got 3.5 sacks so far this year. So he's not. I don't want to compare him to Chase Young athletically, but he is that stereotypical pest, pain in the where Northwestern defender that's just tough. Same thing for Patty Fisher. He's at middle linebacker, 6'4", 250 pounds, give or take. It's going to be interesting to see when Ohio State, when they run the ball. Like you said, we're going to be hearing those names throughout the evening.
Yeah. So, Chip, I'm going to ask you, before we get to our score predictions, let's get to our picks to click for this week. We will start on the defensive side of the football. I will let you go first. Who's your defensive pick to click for the Buckeyes at Northwestern on Friday night?
Okay, defensive first. I'm going to go with Baron Browning, simply because I think he's starting to really, and this is not meant as a slam on Tough Borland, I just think he's starting to, especially in a game like this, I think he is going to be, his athleticism is starting to become more and more apparent, and I think against a team that's really struggling like Northwestern is offensively, I think he's going to have some plays that are going to be, in terms of shutting down drives and making. I anticipate some tackles for loss from Baron Browning on Friday night.
Okay, I'm going to say here's a guy who I think will excel in the run game more than the pass game, because I don't expect a lot out of Northwestern's passing game, and that is Jordan Fuller. I think he's going to come up and make a lot of tackles, especially out on the edge if the Wildcats try to get tricky and get the ball into space out on the edges. So I'm going to go with Jordan Fuller.
Like it.
Okay. Getting to the offensive side of the football, I'm going to go with a guy who got shut out last week and go with Chris Olave having a big bounce-back game against the Wildcats.
Okay, makes sense.
Who do you have on the offense?
Okay, I'm going to be boring, and this is going to be very predictable, but I'm going to go with J.K. Dobbins, simply because what we were just talking about here, about that whole kind of, like frustrating rock fight type thing. I think J.K. Dobbins is going to be the man offensively that, I think Ohio State, they're going to key around him for their success. I think he's going to have a big game.
All right, is the moment of truth, Chip. What is your score prediction for the Buckeyes at the Wildcats?
Well, I'm hoping that Ohio State comes out, takes care of business. I appreciate the fact that you kind of threw me a curveball there in terms of like with the weather and stuff. That could be a factor. But I look at it, I think Ohio State, they just have too much, especially defensively against what is a stagnant Northwestern offense. I'm going to go Ohio State 42, Northwestern 10.
All right. I am going to not be too far off from you, Chip. I think the Buckeyes will, again, I think even if they struggle early, I think they'll wear out Northwestern pretty good and get things going. And I'm going to predict 45-13 Buckeyes. I think maybe at some point Northwestern gets a break, gets the ball in Ohio State's end, has to kick a field goal, or maybe that's when they score their touchdown. But I think, just being at home, I'm going to give them the extra 3 points. So I'm going to say 45-13.
I like it.
All right, so we'll come back next week, and we'll see how each of us did. Chip, I didn't see anything in the Silver Bullets podcast mail on Twitter this week. Remember, you can always hit us up to ask us questions in our mailbag, and we will read them and answer them on the air. And you do that by hitting us up on Twitter with the hashtag SBPmailbag. And you can tweet that in general, and we'll just catch the hashtag and read it on the air. Or you can tweet it right at Chip and myself. I am at Mike36Fan on Twitter, and you, Chip, are at Chip Minnick, MINNICH.
Correct.
All right, so no questions this week, but get them in for next week, and we'll be sure to read them on the air. Chip, anything else you want to discuss before we get out of here?
No, I just, if anything, hope for any Ohio State fan who is making the trip to Evanston, via Chicago, of course. Safe travels. Hope you have a wonderful time. Chicago is one of, if not my favorite town besides where I'm currently living. So have a great time. Be safe.
All right, so that will just about wrap up this edition of the Silver Bullets podcast. We'll be back next week to talk about the Buckeyes and Wildcats and to look ahead to that big game against Bucky on Big Nude Saturday. Looking forward to that. Pants will be off. The folks out there in podcast land can find you where, Chip?
They can find me on Twitter at Chip Minnick, MINNICH. Like Michael, I'm a contributor to the Ozone via the Hayes and Cannon section, as well as I'm a contributor to Athlon Sports.
All right. You can, of course, find me on Twitter at Mike36Fan, at the Ozone Hayes and Cannon section as the Grumpy Old Buckeye, and you can read my non-Buckeye related stuff if you just like to read stuff at michaellikestowrite.com. So check out the stuff over there, especially if you like music. I tend to write about music and how it sort of folds into life and that kind of thing, and I do that quite often, not as often as probably I should, over at michaellikestowrite.com. Give it a look. If you don't like it, don't come back. I guess that's it. So we will be back next week, Chip, to do this again. Nothing left to say, but go Bucks.
Go Bucks.